telekinesis and mastery over illness. They viewed Scientology as intrinsically damaging and disapproved of it in all its forms, independent or corporate. What was striking was the respect all of these ex-members showed each other. Despite irreconcilable differences in their positions, the panel and the audience were all able to express themselves without fear of censorship. There was no coercion, no silencing of opinion, no personal attacks, no suppressive persons. What united the panelists was their focused condemnation of abuse. It was a great example of what a mature atmosphere of free expression could be. As we all know, relationships between escapees from abusive groups aren't always so smooth. Some people get condemned for being too soft and forgiving. Some are condemned for being too hardline and unforgiving. But what really burns is when escapees start using the abusive tactics of their former group on each other. At the Cult in Your Backyard conference, one panelist, John McGee, noted that sometimes independent Scientologists who'd broken away from the organization still engaged in the practice of shunning, known as disconnection. To know the pain of shunning simply for disagreeing, and then inflict it on others simply for disagreeing, is an extremely sad example of copying the enemy. Some folks I've spoken with have left abusive groups that had fixed hierarchical structures, dividing members into elite and subordinate subgroups. Having hoped to find an open, egalitarian community of ex-members, they've reported experiencing a similar hierarchical vibe from some of their fellow escapees. There's a sense that people have carried their former roles with them. It can feel like they've jumped out of the frying pan into a slightly smaller frying pan, and it can spark a lot of distressing memories. Sometimes people copy their enemies in insidious ways that might seem positive at first, but their coercive style is a clue that something else is going on. Some former targets of abuse try to push other former targets to forgive their abusers. They continue to press the point even when their advice is repeatedly declined. They argue and insist and pressurize. They insinuate that a lack of forgiveness shows some moral deficiency, or that it'll somehow backfire on the unforgiving individual. These are some of the same manipulations abusers use to extract forgiveness. These echoes of our abusers are depressing, but understandable. When we've been exposed to certain behavior for an extended period, it becomes a familiar reference model. Sometimes, without thinking, we fall back on what feels familiar. While it's understandable, it's important to recognize these abusive practices and do what we can to eradicate them. Every time we mindfully reject the degrading practices of our former abusive environments, we flush out more of the last remnants of their poison.
Into the breach!
Copying enemies can become an issue in our dealings with our former abusive groups. Our interactions with them can arouse a lot of emotions. To feel anger is perfectly natural. Some people are against expressing it. For me, the expression of anger in itself isn't the problem. Anger's healthy and appropriate when it's focused on the abuse, like it was in the Scientology conference. But it becomes destructive when we begin to vent wildly and indiscriminately, attacking innocent individuals who we lump together with the abusive elements. Sometimes whole demographics are demonized. We attack the body instead of the tumor. The bullied can become bullies in the guise of champions. Thinking of themselves as rescuers who stand for justice, they drift into a persecutor position, actively perpetrating injustice. Unfocused anger helps no one, including ourselves. Because we can plainly see the false reality that underpins our old group, it can feel surreal watching members figuratively walking around on thin air, making assertions with nothing to stand on. Of course, from their angle, the ground beneath us seems just as insubstantial as it once did to us.
Let's go.
Getting to a place where both parties can hear each other can be a delicate process. It helps if we're clear about exactly what we're trying to achieve. Why are we doing this? To feel better about ourselves? To score points? Do we want to rip individuals out of the group at any cost? Around 10 years ago, an atheist YouTuber told me he and some other atheists had held one of their theist friends captive for several hours subjecting him to intense questioning and refutation over the existence of his God. He said they succeeded in deconverting his friend to atheism, although his friend reported a great sense of bleakness. The YouTuber predicted I probably wouldn't approve of their method, but emphasized that it worked. He was right. I was horrified.
Swiftly!
I was horrified because it was done to me, only in reverse. There was a time in my childhood when I was backing out of the religion I'd been indoctrinated into, but I was forced to stay against my will.
I move!
Feeling powerless, I surrendered to a kind of Stockholm Syndrome reaction, embracing a dogmatic ideology I felt imprisoned by. I was broken. Coercive tactics like these have been turned into a career by some folks. Born in 1930, Ted Patrick became famous as a professional deprogrammer, working to break the undue influence of abusive groups on individuals.
Swiftly!
Relatives of targets had been recruited by religious high-control groups who would approach him to help rescue their loved ones. Although Patrick's intentions were positive, his methods were extremely controversial. He had arranged forcible abduction and hold targets against their will in a secure location. Family members were brought in to appeal to the target to come back to them. It could be an emotionally chaotic environment in which parents were free to subject their targets to threats, mockery, and tearful guilt trips. Although Patrick's interventions did produce a few success stories, many of them backfired, driving individuals back to their abusers with their defenses now sky high. Stephen Hassan, a former recruit of the Unification Church, otherwise known as the Moonies, has also made it his life's work to combat the undue influence of high-control groups. Although he's admitted to sometimes arranging to meet recruits under a slightly deceptive pretext, his methods differ substantially from Patrick's. Recruits come freely and can leave at any time. They're simply presented with detailed, accurate information about the group they've become involved with, and allowed to make up their own minds. If the information prods that suppressed individual awake, great. But even if targets go back to their abusive groups, they're not left with distressing memories of being abducted, and the accurate information they've been given might start to chime with their experiences in the group. They've been empowered. For me, this reflects the prime goal. It's not about making people think what we want them to think. That's exactly what abusers do. It's about empowering people with the tools to think for themselves. I wasn't dragged out of the abusive groups I found myself in. I walked out by myself because I'd been able to think independently. When we take independent thinking as our starting point, forceful, combative solutions can give way to nurturing solutions centered around the idea of personal growth. For example, when we see children forced into the religion of their parents, some of us might want to try and outlaw child indoctrination. But another approach is to ensure young children are educated about all religions and about the option of ticking none. That way, we help to empower them with information.
Only time this guy can get a last hit.
There'll always be abusers and dogmatists. Rather than focus on limiting their behavior, we can limit their influence by educating and empowering our children. When you lie down with dogs, you get up with fleas. When you leave a poisonous environment, sometimes you take a little poison with you. But it doesn't have to be a permanent feature. Every time we notice some of that poison in ourselves, we get the chance to detox by choosing to grow and define ourselves on our own terms, instead of copying enemies.
Swiftly!
Radiant structures must have been fortified.
Damage. I didn't see that coming. On.
Not the strongest enemy I've grappled with.
Attack. Denied. I'll not argue. Here I come. Indeed.
Growing up, in our early years, we encountered two remarkably similar authority figures. Both figures were presented as loving, but it was an odd kind of love. Jealous, inconsistent, possessive,
Here's ice in your eye.
vengeful, divisive. They would set traps to test the folks they supposedly loved, presenting their targets with impossible, damned if you do, damned if you don't choices. This love would evaporate instantly in response to any exercise of
Radiant's
independence.
courier's a goner.
Both figures were presented
Can't
as
do nothing about
blameless.
dire structures
They
right
were
now.
perfectly moral, righteous, and beyond criticism. If their actions caused destruction, harm, even death, blame was deflected onto others. If their behavior seemed contradictory, hypocritical, or just plain cruel, it was because we were too young and inexperienced to understand their superior morality. Both figures were presented as omniscient.
Can't get
We
enough
were
of it.
repeatedly told
splashed.
they both knew our minds better than we did, which was deeply confusing because they so often got it wrong. We'd be accused of transgressions we'd never committed, thoughts we'd never entertained, personality traits we didn't recognize. Who were these two figures?
I
One
thought
was a
as much.
parent, the other was a god, and both of them
I come in
narcissists.
both with ulti.
It's a disorder that shows up in situations from abusive one-to-one relationships
I come in,
to
I come in.
reality-twisting political, religious, and social groups. Too often, it goes
Down.
undetected. Sometimes it's downplayed as harmless personality quirks. Sometimes the narcissist
Into the
holds a
breach.
protected authority position, allowing them to get away with abuses we wouldn't normally tolerate.
Indeed.
Sometimes we're dealing with what's called a communal narcissist, who puts on a deeply humanitarian
Forward.
act for the community and abuses behind closed doors. Narcissism is a big factor in religious and domestic abuse, and awareness of its distinctive symptoms
The ice
is
wolf bite.
growing. The term
you
narcissist
go, good at denying,
originates in
buddy.
the story of Narcissus, featured in Ovid's
Faster.
Instead of just fucking
Metamorphoses,
right-clicking
who
the wave
was
all day
widely
in the
desired for his
creation.
beauty. A young nymph called Echo fell in love with him, but he rejected her,
come.
and she faded away until all that remained of her was her voice, which could only repeat what
Let's
other
go.
people said. Nemesis, the god of justice and revenge, cursed Narcissus
I'll
to pursue
finish that.
unattainable love. He fell in love with his own reflection in a pool and, fixated on the image,
Yes.
slowly wasted away, replaced by a flower.
They're meaning to
Therapist
smash
John
that bottom tower
Lashkar
here.
describes narcissists as individuals who need perfect mirroring, perfect stroking, perfect
This'll
responses,
come in handy.
who have idealized an
You can do
omnipotent
chrono.
I'll not
fantasies
argue.
and seek out others to confirm or justify
Chrono this guy.
exaggerated
Tower.
entitlement fantasies and distortions that the world is deeply indebted
Let's
to
do
them.
it.
Although Narcissus was captivated by his
bottom
physical
tower ain't
reflection,
long for this
narcissists generally avoid
this a
personal
trick?
self-reflection.
Illusion.
Critical examination conflicts with their grandiose self-image, and taking responsibility for their mistakes and transgressions is unbearable to them, leading to bizarre deflections of blame onto others. Because of their superiority complex, they're easily insulted by
I
perceived
know.
criticisms and enraged when they don't get the excessive respect or adoration they crave.
I thought as much.
They're controlling and resentfully jealous when
That's
others get the
nice.
attention they seek for themselves.
Let's
They
go.
expect
The other
others to
fella came
cater
to wreck your
exclusively
bottom
to them
tower.
and disregard other people's needs. The needs of the narcissist eclipse everything and everyone else.
Might want to check
Other
your bottom
people
tower.
are just pawns
Here I
in the
come.
narcissist's
nice,
grand
well made,
plan. The combination of an unstable
Oh, he's
sense of
ancient,
self,
too.
a lack of empathy, and a fiery determination to get what they
Towers in
want
a tight
results in
spot.
Don't do it
unpredictable,
in next time,
capricious
please.
behavior. Malignant
Indeed.
narcissists will inflict gratuitous suffering on others for their own
Bottom tower
gratification.
ain't long for this
We
world.
want to explore this
No
pathology.
breaking down the radiant
Are
structures
gods
like
inevitably narcissistic?
Into the
How do
breach.
targets get manipulated? How far does the narcissist's poison spread? And how do we go about extracting ourselves?
Indeed.
The other fella's aiming to wreck your bottom
I'll not
tower.
argue.
Hope you weren't partial to your bottom tower.
Even if the Jewish Tanakh, the Christian Bible,
Yes.
and the Islamic Quran weren't dripping with illustrations of all the narcissistic traits, narcissism is written into the
You can do
blueprint
Corona.
of all these God concepts because of two factors. First, their monotheistic
Can't outrun
nature.
a wildfire.
Second, their human inventors' overzealous desire for justice.
Forward.
Writing in the 1800s, philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach points out that monotheism creates a special
I thought
problem,
it
Have fun trying
whereas
to bust
polytheism
down
gives room
radiant
for good
structures
and evil gods. Monotheism is forced to combine good and evil into one
Into the
being,
breach.
creating a god with conflicting attributes. Feuerbach notes that humans
The
who
ice will
believe all
spike.
things were created for their sole benefit and that there should be no evils run into a universe that conflicts
Let's
with these
go.
self-centered beliefs by imposing all kinds of suffering. This is the classic problem of evil.
Faster.
Writing in the 1700s, philosopher David Hume summarized the problem. Is the monotheist God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is impotent. Is he
Monkey
able
King
but
right here,
not
retard.
willing?
I move.
Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then where does evil come from? All these statements assume the God in question is aware of our suffering. An unaware God could be considered blameless. But folks who
Here I
propose
come.
an interventionist God, intimately aware of suffering, can't claim divine ignorance.
My eyes.
In fact, impotence, malevolence, or callousness. Feuerbach notes that to try and preserve their deity's good and helpful image,
Swiftly.
some theists treat human suffering as punishments for transgressions. Destructive aspects of the natural universe are
They're
reframed
meaning
as
to
expressions
smash
of
that bottom
divine
tower of
righteous
yours.
anger. Justice is misattributed
This one's
to a
all
universe that
mine.
has no inherent justice. This profound distortion of reality creates a core characteristic of narcissism: capriciousness. In his paper, Divine Narcissism and Yahweh's Parenting Style, Stuart Lazine notes that abusers use capriciousness as a tool to impose domination. By following no discernible rules, human narcissists
Hook shot
put their
and
targets
serpent
in
her
a
down.
perpetually confused state, wondering what's coming next. Likewise, a divine narcissist
Into
that
the
causes
breach.
random suffering puts humans in a perpetually confused state. It also leads directly
come.
to persecution games. When humans argue about why good people suffer, one persecution game is called Suffering for the Few. Here, the universe punishes good people for failing to condemn bad people.
Forward.
For example, natural disasters have been blamed on the acceptance of gay people. This game dehumanizes specific groups, turning them into
I'll not argue.
scapegoats. In another persecution game called Born Wrong, the universe punishes good people
Agreed.
because they're not actually good at all. It's claimed
They have
that we're
privilege,
all
right?
born defective
To battle.
and have to try to
Yeah.
overcome
Looking
our
fortified.
rotten nature. Here, everyone is dehumanized and open to
Indeed.
abuse, sometimes self-inflicted.
Can we kill
Ironically,
him? Can we kill this guy, please?
monotheism's failure to
yep,
explain
yep.
why countless
I
good
can.
people
Tower ain't
suffer
doing
has
too well.
resulted in countless more good people suffering.
On.
Far from solving the problem of evil,
He
these
has savage.
persecution
I'm
games
so
just
scared.
add more evil to be accounted
Forward.
for, taking us back to a deity who is either unable or unwilling
Just
to
run, run,
prevent
run,
it.
run, run.
To get round the problem of evil,
We can
some
fight, I
monotheists
guess.
have even tried to smuggle in
Here's
polytheistic
ice in your eye.
concepts. In Christianity, Satan is introduced as a shadow god,
Let's
taking
go.
on the
Hookshot, no
destructive
hookshot.
aspect of the universe, to establish the main god Yahweh as the good god. Jehovah's Witnesses
come.
even view Satan as the ruler of the world.
Omni slash, be
This
careful.
only
Oh,
shifts the
careful,
problem of evil back a step,
Down you
giving us a
go.
deity who's aware of Satan's evil, but either unable or unwilling to prevent it.
Ice. Take
When
you.
humans project their wishful desire for justice onto an unjust universe by inventing a single,
move.
omniscient, all-powerful, interventionist God, The paths repeatedly
Can
lead
you ult this guy?
back to
Can you ult this
narcissist
guy?
territory and division and
Yeah, go
suffering.
no.
Leo Tolstoy's novel Anna Karenina begins with the line, "Happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way." But the unhappiness that surrounds narcissists follows a very distinctive pattern. In comparing their experiences of narcissists, many folks have commented that it's almost as if their abusers all read the same instruction manual. That's because we're dealing with a similar mindset. The mindset of a maniacal child determined to get what it wants, with all the crude strategies of an infant. Like infants, human and divine narcissists exhibit stark, black and white thinking. People are idealized or demonized.
Why do you have 1,000 gold?
In families, offspring are typically split into the favored golden child and the despised scapegoat who gets all the blame, sparking deep divisions. In the Bible, divine narcissist Yahweh has many golden children and scapegoats. He gives Gideon extraordinary preferential treatment, choosing him to lead the Israelite army and defeat the Midianites, even though Gideon repeatedly breaks a divine rule by testing Yahweh to provide miraculous proofs. Gideon's father is a worshipper of Baal, a sin against the jealous Yahweh, and we're told children will be punished for their parents' blasphemous worship. But Gideon not only escapes all punishment, he's chosen as Yahweh's champion. Golden children aren't immune to abuse. Job is initially blessed for being Yahweh's faithful servant. But then, Yahweh agrees to let Satan attack Job relentlessly, destroying all he values, killing his 10 children, just to see if this will provoke Job into cursing Yahweh. At the end of the story, we're told that Yahweh restores Job's fortunes, giving him 10 more children to replace the murdered ones. This is a chilling, psychopathic view of restoration. Humans aren't replaceable objects, but that's how we're seen by malignant black and white thinking narcissists, who can quickly turn golden children into scapegoats, and vice versa. Black and white thinking underpins the binary system of hell and heaven. Imagine a human legal system where everything from genocide to stealing an apple is punished with a life sentence. Who could fail to see the absurdity of such a system? But millions of people defend an even more absurd system that not only extends the sentence from life to eternity, but adds thought, giving the thought the same weight as the act. Some apologists for Yahweh have claimed that because he's conceived as an infinite being, transgressions against him become infinite transgressions, deserving infinite punishment. This reasoning goes in exactly the wrong direction. Stealing an apple from a man who only has one apple to his name has a much greater impact than stealing an apple from a man who owns 50 orchards. If we're going to take the scale of the injured party into account in sentencing, we're looking at an inverse relationship. The larger the party, the smaller the injury, the shorter the sentence. As the injured party approaches infinity, the sentence doesn't approach infinity, it approaches zero. The maniacal child is concerned only with getting what it wants. Playing fair makes no sense. The narcissist plays dirty, instigating psychological games by adopting the dramatic roles of persecutor or victim to tenderize their targets into submission. Both roles are abusive and employ emotional blackmail to arouse fear, obligation, guilt, and sympathy. These strategies are clearly implemented in the Christian Bible. In the Old Testament, Yahweh is in full persecutor mode, condemning all of humanity for the theft of a piece of fruit, committing genocide after genocide, and repeatedly declaring his desire to be feared. In the New Testament, Yahweh flips into victim mode, staging a contrived piece of theatre in which he sacrifices himself to himself.
I think Jero can sit on gold.
But what was the real reason for this so-called sacrifice? Yahweh had invented a system of magic that demanded blood to atone for sins. To honor this blood magic, Yahweh commanded humans to perform animal sacrifices. Then he decided to stop this practice. But according to the rules he invented, blood still had to be shed. Yahweh could have simply chosen to change those rules. He changed all kinds of other rules to suit himself. But he freely chooses an act of self-immolation. And he does it in the most manipulative, melodramatic way, getting humans to kill him. If he insisted on shedding his own blood, He could have done it
Jack is
privately,
made.
without any fanfare. Or, instead of being sacrificed in human form, he could have been
breaking through
born
the
as a sacrificial
structures
goat or
now.
pig,
What is
a
going
fitting
on?
final sacrifice, in view of all the animals needlessly slaughtered in his name.
Freeze you
But
fast.
then there would have been no drama, and drama is oxygen to the narcissist.
Oh, he has drums
This
and
was
the
no
ghost.
genuine
Oh my
sacrifice,
goodness.
just selfish theatrics, designed to dump false guilt onto humans to deflect attention from Yahweh's mistakes. Sadly, victims of narcissists often end up feeling like they're the guilty ones. In the story of Job, who ended up apologizing? Was it Yahweh, who colluded in Job's torment just to satisfy his own vanity? Or was it Job, who suffered the torment? Narcissists rarely apologize. If pushed,
can't rely on
they
Job
might
for
give
anything.
evasive non-apologies or faux-apologies, using distancing or
Into the
conditional language, or claiming both parties are equally to blame. Different situations
Did
call for
smoke, they did
different
smoke.
personal boundaries.
100%.
After damage to a relationship, it's normal to have a period of distance to reflect on what's happened. But when narcissists perform an apology, instant forgiveness is expected. And if it's not given, the abuse can soon start again, showing how meaningless the apology was.
They have no
Boundaries
job.
are so alien to narcissistic gods. They grant divine forgiveness on behalf of everyone else. When we attended church as children, we noticed how priests routinely passed on divine forgiveness to individuals who never sought it from the ones they abused. No one can absolve us for our trespasses against other people. Forgiveness comes or doesn't come from the injured party. Boundaries make it clear what we will and won't accept, and they're crucial in any relationship.
Let's go.
Narcissists hate boundaries. Targets are seen as possessions with no identity of their own. Narcissistic lovers expect partners to adopt their preferences. Narcissistic parents feel entitled to choose their offspring's partners and careers. Narcissistic gods even violate the privacy of our minds, monitoring and punishing our thoughts. When targets start establishing basic boundaries, a narcissist reacts with rage and punishment. When non-believers establish the reasonable boundary of independent thought, they're ostracized, condemned, and threatened with eternal torture.
To battle.
But it's when a target establishes a terminal boundary and walks out for good that the drama can escalate, sometimes becoming deadly. For narcissists, total rejection is the worst crime of all. We see it with human narcissists who relentlessly persecute former lovers, and we see it with divine narcissists. Special animosity is reserved for apostates, like ex-Muslims and ex-Catholics, who are labelled culpably ignorant.
Yep.
Non-believers who've never heard the message are considered blameless and
And
potentially
after also we
savoury.
can take all
Ex-Muslims and
bounties, I
ex-Catholics
guess.
are said to have heard the true message of their religions and stubbornly
Bounties, so-
rejected it, putting them beyond salvation. Ex-Muslims continue to be ostracized,
Void, can you
harassed,
come to
imprisoned,
us? We wanna
and
kill
murdered for rejecting the
game.
narcissist god of Islam. There are narcissists in all walks of life, but they can be hardest to deal with when they hold protected social positions. Magical thinking doesn't just
I
apply
will
to
take a
supernatural
region, okay?
things. The subject of families provokes all kinds of magical ideas about obligation, intrinsic value, and irreplaceability, which serve to protect narcissists in the family, who play on the deep social taboos associated with family conflict to keep abuse under the radar. Abusive families can act like cults, closed systems
I wanna
with
kill
no external appeal.
Shadow
It's been
Shaman.
said that blood is
Warlord.
thicker than water, and for very family-orientated people who've enjoyed genuinely healthy, supportive relationships, it can be deeply unsettling to hear values like that being questioned. But for many families where there's narcissistic abuse, blood is just messier than water. Magical thinking extends to other figures who are unthinkingly treated as surrogate parents.
The other
Therapists,
fellas lost a
rabbis,
More,
priests,
we have chronosphere, we
imams,
have chronosphere.
presidents and prime ministers, royalty. We assume they're looking after
I have
our
a region
interests,
in my
when it
bottle.
turns out they're just looking after
This'll
their
come
own
in.
interests, at our expense. Our magical
Into the
thinking can
breach.
put us in a state of denial. Gods are the ultimate parent figures,
Died without
and
being
theistic
there,
religions
guys.
attract
Died
many
without being
human
there.
narcissists who feel no shame in claiming to
Let's
speak
take
on their god's
bottom. Why don't we
behalf.
just go bottom?
The powerful magical thinking
Here I
that
come.
surrounds
Yeah, we can do
gods shields these religious narcissists who use their protective positions to become the focus of worship themselves.
Indeed.
On the subject of worship, The ancient Greek philosopher
What
Xenophanes
was
famously
I'll not
criticized the
argue.
human tendency to attribute gods with human traits and desires, especially human flaws. The need to be worshipped is one such human flaw, and it's a self-defeating flaw. The very act of demanding worship exposes a deep inadequacy, confirming the individual's
Swiftly.
unworthiness.
The
It's
other
important
fella's
to
bottom
recognize
tower's
worship
gone
for what
good.
it is, a response to threat. In the face of danger, we instinctively react in one of several ways. We fight,
My eyes
we take
find
flight,
deep.
we freeze. Another strategy is to fawn, to submit, to please,
On.
to praise, to worship. Some claim that worship is a free expression of adoration, but you only have to look at the threats and attacks aimed at those of us who decline to worship any gods to recognize the underlying coercion. If it was a free expression, we would be unmolested. Things go from bad to bizarre when we come to the narcissist tactic of gaslighting. The concept of gaslighting originates from a 1938 play by Patrick
Well, that
Hamilton,
could've gone
adapted
worse.
into the brilliant 1940 film Gaslight,
Let's go.
in which a husband tries to convince his wife she's going mad. What she doesn't know is that her husband is a murderer, who each night secretly searches for jewels he thinks are hidden above the apartment. Whenever he lights the gaslight above the apartment to search for the jewels, the gaslight dims in the rooms below. When his wife comments on the dimming gaslight, he tells her she's imagining it. Like the tyrannical husband in Gaslight, narcissists will often try to gaslight their targets, to use lies, denial, and psychological tricks to make their targets distrust their own memory, perceptions, and behavior, even their own sanity. The Abrahamic religions have gaslighting down to a fine art, proposing incoherent values and rules that are impossible to observe
thought as
consistently, putting followers in impossible double binds by condoning and condemning the same behaviors,
Agreed.
declaring acts that cause no conceivable injury to be worthy of torture and death, pronouncing us guilty of events before our birth. These maneuvers erode our sense of judgment, making us more susceptible to religious control. We're directed to develop a relationship with a divine being who, we're told, withholds evidence of itself for the bizarre reason that it wants us to have the option of not believing it exists. If human parents deliberately withheld all evidence of their existence from a child while claiming to want a relationship with the child, we'd immediately see the madness of that scenario. Substitute human parent with divine being, and we get exactly the same madness. Our well-founded questions and criticisms are met with constantly shifting goalposts, and the pretense that contradiction is actually profound mystery. We're explicitly instructed to distrust our own judgment. This is all done to get targets to accept the false reality of the narcissist.
Indeed.
Establishing a false reality isn't a trivial issue for the narcissist. It's a matter of survival. It means they don't have to face the truth about themselves.
Bang!
Eternity of embarrassment.
In Lyman Frank Baum's story of The Wizard of Oz, winged monkeys were sent to do the bidding of the Wicked Witch of the West. The term flying monkeys is now